Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to be teaching a lesson on a specific subgenre of fantasy known as urban fantasy. This is a subgenre that within the last 2 decades has become a real titan in the world of teen television and literature. Speaking of shows specifically, in the 2000s we had stuff like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Being Human, and Witchblade. In the 2010s, we had a whole bunch of series, but the biggest of those were probably Supernatural, Grimm, and a show called Preacher. In this video, we're going to be going over the definition and themes of the literary, film, and TV movement that supported and made room for these massive cultural icons, at least to teens within those years. For this lesson, I'm only assuming a minor familiarity with broader fantasy from my viewer and little to no familiarity with the subgenre of urban fiction. If you've seen the Lord of the Rings or the Harry Potter movies, you should have no problem understanding the language that I use, and by the end of this video, you'll hopefully be equipped to hold a somewhat in-depth conversation about urban fantasy, both by understanding what urban fantasy is, as well as being able to give two key elements that make up the subgenre aside from its definition. Further, you'll hopefully be better suited to enjoy urban fantasy in the future. We won't have time to go in depth about the main authors and history of this style of fiction, but perhaps that will make up a future video. First, how do we want to define urban fantasy? The name is perhaps self-explanatory, but there is more to it than just having a city and a magical setting. For example, we don't call Lord of the Rings urban fantasy just because the characters in Rivendell visit Rivendell and Minas Tirith. Instead, the cities in the magical setting has to be a focus. It can't just be a magical setting that involves cities, but the genre has to focus upon city living and the urban experience. It sprung up mostly in the 19th century alongside ever-increasing industrialization, classicism, and urbanization, as well as a renewed interest in horror fiction and the fantastic. With this origin in mind, we have two primary definitions. First, urban fantasy is normally defined as a story set within a contemporary, that is, modern, urban environment with a hidden element of the supernatural that is slowly revealed to the main character. In this form of fantasy, or urban fantasy, the urban is the primary setting and the fantasy is a secondary modifier that shows certain themes of the urban. Prime examples of this type of urban fantasy are Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere from 1997 and Jamie Delano's run of Hellblazer from 1988 to 1991. The second definition, and I would argue that this is a secondary definition because of where the focus of modern urban fantasy lies, is when you have a fantasy setting that focuses in on urban living. So for this, opposed to being a contemporary urban setting, it is a city within a fantasy world. We can think of parts of Game of Thrones, a lot of Discworld, but prime examples would be Daniel Polanski's Lowtown series, wherein you have a hardened detective solving mystical crimes within a fantasy city, and the City Watch sub-series of the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett. These two definitions also speak to the two main elements in urban fiction, the city and the magic. Which element is focused on greatly changes the feel and purpose of the work, but there are also important other elements. With the urban and the fantasy, we can kind of see these as a continuum, with the urban on one side and the fantasy on the other side, and urban fantasy kind of lying in the middle, but it can go either way, depending on the definition we're looking to use. Outside of this definition and those two major aspects, we have two important literary features. The first of these is the concept of the unknown and sometimes unknowable living within plain sight. In line with the genre's origins in industrialization, classicism, and urbanization, people were realizing that they could live amidst thousands upon thousands of people and yet be totally unknown. And this isn't just on a personal level, but people in cities realized you could live right next to the most flamboyant subculture or shop or people group and have no idea of their existence. Like, you could have a crazy neighbor upstairs and you have no idea. Because people don't really know their neighbors within cities, or at least it would seem that way sometimes. This element has been named by scholar Stephen Ekman as the unseen, and will be referred to as such henceforth. This concept is easily seen in shows like Being Human, wherein fantastical creatures have to navigate the various cultures they find themselves in, while recognizing that they would be hunted and destroyed if they were to reveal themselves to the broader culture. In a different way, Neverwhere shows a version of London with secret entrances to an entirely other London, known as the London Below. These works, one focused on individual characters, the other focused on a larger community, both feed into this concept of the unseen. These fantastical things are completely faded into the background of the urban environment because of the hustle and bustle of this landscape, because of how involved normal people are in their own lives, troubles, and worldviews. They are unable, or perhaps unwilling, to see things that would disrupt that worldview. The second element that lies outside the basic definition of the genre is that of social outcasts and rejects. Just as there are many areas in real-life cities that are separated by class, financial status, and race, the same thing applies to urban fantasies, and in fact is one of the cornerstones. The werewolves are going to live apart from the vampires, and the vampires are going to live apart from the humans. And quite often, these groups neither support nor like each other. We can call this theme marginalization. Most often, the protagonist is one who does not really fit into any group, and must make a name for themselves with no help, acceptance, or support from anyone except for a couple friends, usually kept at arm's length. This aspect is probably why the genre is so popular amongst young adults, as they have to form their own self-identity and can often feel apart from the cultures they found themselves growing up in. The urban fantasy genre can turn this insecurity and lack of self-identity into a strength that helps you navigate between worlds. We can see this in the prominence of anti-heroes and oddities that make up the protagonists of the urban fantasy genre. For example, we have John Constantine in the Hellblazer series and Richard Mayhew in Neverwhere. In the first case, Constantine fits in nowhere because he acts as a bridge between worlds. He's a hardened detective that regular people come to when they experience something that doesn't fit into their worldview. Outside of that use, he makes people uncomfortable, and they do not want him in their lives. For the fantastical side, Constantine acts as a liability, wherein their delicate lives and identities could be disrupted and destroyed. He fits into neither category, and yet is involved with, and often hated by, both. For Richard Mayhew of Neverwhere, he starts to become invisible and unable to interact with the mundane as he delves further into the fantastic. What he has seen and has to say would make normal people uncomfortable, and so he loses the ability to tell them about it. Or perhaps they lose the ability to listen. Both of these men, through interacting with the strange but still trying to hold on to parts of the normal, become marginalized by both. We now have a fairly solid definition for the genre. Urban fantasy is simply when the ideas and problems of a personal life in a city become intertwined with the going-ons of a magical culture or subculture. Two common elements to this definition, regardless of whether the urban or the fantastic is focused on, are the unseen and marginalization. Things can exist under our noses, remaining completely hidden simply by our will to not believe. Related to this concept of the unseen, urban fantasy also focuses on how we hate and reject that which is different from us. Those that fit neither into the normal nor the fantastic are often hated by both. At the end of this lesson, you should now hopefully be able to recognize urban fantasy and read and watch it in a more informed manner. Rather than just pure entertainment, urban fantasy contains elements that show us important aspects of the human condition that are more applicable to modern day than we may at first realize. Very few werewolves are just werewolves, and perhaps the vampire someone is staking through the heart is quite insecure about their vampirism. Thanks for watching.